Alright you guys, let me start this out first by thanking everybody that submitted a question. There were a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this up into 3 parts. If I didn't include you and your question in this first Q&A, I'm going to try to get as many of you as I can in the next 2, so be looking for it. Let's get straight to it. The Martin 9400 wants to know, did these hit squads ever go after NF dropouts? You think the NF leadership would want dropouts taken out as much, if not more, than street sureños? Yes, at one time there were squads that were designated and used strictly for the purpose of combating these types of street gang issues. But in the early 90s, when the regiments were called colonias and they were compartmentalized, we used to have what was called wrecking crews that were used specifically for this purpose. The colonias were broken up into different squads. You had a wrecking crew, a robbery crew, a dope slinging crew, etc., etc. Regiments usually didn't use their manpower for gangbanging. Some of the bigger street gangs in these areas were utilized to combat these problems. However, when it comes to dropouts or NF hermits, these were assignments that were handled specifically by the regiments. But again, these types of assignments were more prevalent back in the early 90s. Different era, different breed. Nowadays, the regiments are more focused on generating money and preserving their manpower. So targeting dropouts is just not as common. It just depends on the circumstances, because although dropouts are considered the #1 enemy and the worst form of degenerate out there, manpower is so scarce and limited that preservation usually takes precedence. The only other time when these regiments really got involved in the street conflict with the sureños is around 1998 when Cuete circulated that filter, El Norte Law. So Zab Zuda wants to know, now that the NF has been in the federal system for a while, are they aligned or at war with any other nationwide gangs such as the Latin Kings, DC Blacks, Chicago gangs? As far as I know, they haven't forged an alliance with any other nationwide gang that has stuck or has become a permanent thing. I've heard that on a few occasions when conflicts have kicked off that they either rolled with another gang or had the backing of another gang. But these were isolated incidents. As far as being at war with other gangs, they've had issues with the DC Blacks, the Aryan Brotherhood, the MA, etc., etc. But again, these were isolated incidents with different gangs at different USPs that were just as a result of the politics at those USPs. It didn't have a blanket effect. In other words, it didn't spill over into other prisons. Once it was dealt with on that yard, that was the end of it. So North Pole 831 wants to know, if Skip and leadership never go to the feds because of Black Widow, is Brown Bob still alive today? Did they feel a certain type of way about BB falling back, or was it just a new boss trying to prove something? I'm not sure that Operation Black Widow had much of an effect on what happened to Brown Bob one way or the other. Brown Bob was killed in 1999. Operation Black Widow broke in 2000-2001. So the majority of leadership were still housed in Pelican Bay when Brown Bob was killed. In 1992, Pinky was one of 21 NF members indicted in Santa Clara County. This was the indictment with Big Chente, Lucky, Silencio, Huevo, Skip, and the others. That case dragged on for close to 6 years. Pinky was going back and forth to court, but towards 1997, when he went back for sentencing, his position as the GOP, General Pintas, was passed over to Cuete from Tulare County on an interim basis. This is when Cuete single-handedly called that hit on BB. So the question should have been, if Pinky hadn't passed over the Llaves, would BB still be alive? Maybe so, but it's a toss-up. Issues were still surfacing with regard to BB, such as Pantera accusing him and Big Smiley from Salinas of treason because of the deep facility dilemmas. Then he was being accused of desertion for falling out of contact. There was also rumors of him guest speaking at MAG conferences. And finally, some people like Chuco were trying to make an issue out of him covering up the NF tattoo he had on his back. How Pinky would have elected to deal with all that would have depended on whether or not he would have still been alive today. You never know. Unfortunately, my crystal ball is telling me that he had a lot working against him, so who knows. So John Newman wants to know, my question is this. You say that you were never given the benefit of the doubt over the phone calls that caused your problems. If you were given the opportunity to present your case to the generals, What would you have said? And do you think that if you were given the chance to make your case, do you believe the outcome would have been the same? Anyways, respects all the way from Brisbane, a city on the east coast of Australia. It's my UK motherfucking homie right there. That's a good question. It most definitely would have changed the outcome. If I would have been given the benefit of the doubt and I would have been allowed to go to trial and get convicted, then things definitely would have been different. Think about it. Under those circumstances, I would have been given a life sentence. I would have got shipped back up to Pelican Bay, and then, as you put it, I would have been given a chance to present my case, right? What would have been left to go on to investigate at that point? Some meaningless phone calls where I kept my dying wife pacified by telling her I'd cooperate if I needed to in order to get back home to her. The bottom line is, I wouldn't have cooperated, and no matter how you spin it, that's something that you can't just discount. I understand that I had no business even talking like that. I always acknowledged this because I knew better, but I only did it to keep my wife believing that there was still light at the end of the tunnel. Regardless to what I said in the calls, at the end of the day, I wouldn't have cooperated, and that would have been the defining factor. Unless I just would have been held to that high of a standard to where just the mere fact that I said those things would have sunk me no matter what, then I guess it is what it is. You asked what I would have told them. The obvious. I only said what I said because my wife was dying, and she did die. And I would have adamantly pointed out the fact that there's not one single piece of paperwork anyone can produce to show otherwise. It's as simple as that. So yes, I think things would have been different, especially with no paperwork to ever show that I ever crossed that line, and the fact that I took a life sentence. That should have been the prevailing factor. I always knew that I was fighting an uphill battle. I was never just that confident that I'd just be okay, but I was willing to take that chance. I knew it was a 50-50 toss-up either way, but my beliefs and my convictions would have pushed me to take that chance. If you read my book, then you should already know that they were already aware of the phone calls. And although everybody agreed that I had no business talking like that, they were willing to give me the benefit of the doubt based on the fact that Dancing Bear had submitted a full report on it, and based on the fact that after 5 years there was no paperwork. They knew about everything that happened up in Pelican Bay. They were aware of all the phone calls, but I couldn't overcome the dirty politics. When Lencho sent a filter up to leadership, giving them a false impression, telling them that he had actual black and white confirming I was snitching, that's what sabotaged me. He led them to believe that he was in possession of some police reports, some statements, or something else that they weren't aware of, and he knew what he was doing. He purposely left out the fact that what he was referring to were phone calls. Had he told them that the paperwork he was referring to were my phone calls that were now transcribed, they would have told him that they were already aware of that. That was dirty politicking right there, man. But in retrospect, I'm glad he sabotaged me and that they jumped the gun without looking into it further, because I wouldn't have been able to muster up the strength to walk away and make the decisions that I did later. I would have took that life sentence and I wouldn't be answering your question right now. Zom Kill Flores wants to know, do you know any MA members who you keep mutual respect towards and talk to? With that being said, do you think La M has a strong command structure similar to that of what the NF originally had? Do they also have controversy between Fed and state factions? Of course, the MA has had issues between their state and Fed factions. I'm not aware of any specific disagreements that they've had, and as far as I know, they're not at odds right now, but I'm sure they've had their differences somewhere in the past. All the organizations have. There would be something wrong if they just agreed with everything and didn't have different visions. As far as whether I think they're a strong organization, of course they are. The M is very strong, and history is their witness. That organization withstood a lot, and is still in existence. Not just the pressures from law enforcement and them getting hit with several huge indictments, but they've been through a lot of wars, both internally and externally. I personally don't think that the MA has ever reached its full potential. They also have a strong following. Nobody can deny that the Sureños are not a powerful force, but their numbers are off the chain. I think if they went back to the paramilitary structure that they used to operate under, i.e. generals, lieutenants, captains, etc., they'd be a lot stronger and a lot more organized. When everyone's on the same level and they do things individually, it invites dissidence and infighting. It's hard to maintain order and equilibrium like that. That's why they sometimes bump heads and one crew ends up fighting against another crew. As far as the mutual respect, that's across the board. When I was active, I maintained solid public relations with all of them. If I found out they were one of their brothers, then I would extend my hand and give them that respect off the top. The only way they wouldn't have that coming is if I ran into one of them that had a chip on his shoulder, but that was far and few. Then it would be on an individual basis. But even in times of war, I would still communicate with them. I got to know most of the ones on death row. Whenever I go back to the AC, they'd always look out for me, and vice versa. Mr. Local wants to know, why did DC turn his back on the federal fellas? Why did he take the state side? He had a strong relationship with them fellas, and why didn't he get indicted and go to ADX with the other fellas? I don't think DC turned his back. I think DC is being manipulated, and I think he's just conforming with what others around him are doing. DC's old, bro. I know him well. When it comes to internal disparities like what's happening right now, he's non-confrontational. Trust me, if you put DC in the same room with Corny, Skip, Pinky, or any of the others in the feds that have influence, DC would act like nothing even happened. You alluded to him having a strong relationship with them brothers in the feds. I agree, but in this day and time, that means nothing. Honor, trust, friendship, loyalty, and all that other good stuff get dropped fast these days, with no hesitation and without a second thought. Does that really surprise you? It doesn't surprise me at all. These guys change direction depending on which way the wind blows. I learned that myself. As far as why DC didn't get indicted, that's a good question. Either he's lucky or he's smart. No, seriously. I honestly believe that DC didn't get indicted because his name wasn't thrown in a lot of the business that was happening. He had influence in some of the street affairs and in some of the major decisions that were being made, but I know for a fact that his stamp wasn't being used a lot. I functioned directly with the upper echelon and with those in that circle of leadership, so I seen firsthand what was going on. DC's name just wasn't out there that much, and I believe that this is probably what saved him. So, C9er48 wants to know, there's a lot of talk and rumor mill that the Fed generals are going to make their move against the self-proclaimed generals from the state. So my question is, why has it taken so long for the big homies in the feds to make their move against the state when these dudes in the feds lost their control after Operation Black Widow 20 years ago? Damn, bro, has it really been 20 years ago already? Where the hell does time go? Anyway, brother, the reason why I think this is dragging on is due to the lack of willing participants because it's a very complex situation. Think about it. I'm sure there's a lot of C's like Balukas from Oakland, Sleepers from San Jose, Mondo from Delano, Spider from Lodi, etc., that are still loyal to these guys but are kind of in a tough spot right now. I'm sure some of them have thought about taking that assignment and fulfilling the Fed's agenda. But then there's the unknown about what happens after that and what type of position that's going to leave them in. So let's say hypothetically one of them says, fuck it, I'm going to get rid of these dudes. Once it's done, what kind of position does this leave them in? Will the rest of the state concede and fall in line with the feds once the head's cut off? Or will they continue following the same path that they're on now? Trust me, this is one of the critical questions, because if they continue on that path, then they're deemed in the state with no backing and all their support is 1,000 miles away in the federal prison system. That's not too appealing to the majority. To be ostracized by the brothers in the state and then their own fate will be in serious question. On the other hand, if there's growing support and it's being talked about in secrecy, then I believe this is just a matter of time. Conejo can be heavy-handed and his leadership skills don't always draw overwhelming confidence. I believe he's his own worst enemy and he'll sink himself in time. When he starts discouraging some of those C's and they begin to feel like he's no longer working in the best interest of the O, that's when someone's going to punch his ticket and get rid of him. They already feel like there's justification since the feds want him laid down. So if he loses full support from the manpower in the state, someone's going to step up and play the hero. Watch, I know it's been a while, It might even take a couple more years, but sooner or later, the right seed and the right circumstances are going to present themselves. If it's not someone who loses faith in him in Chuco, it'll be someone who's been to the federal system that goes into the state that's going to slide right up next to them dudes. All I know is that them two better keep all them C's in the state happy, and they better keep them all believing that they're doing the right thing by following them. So Simon Morales wants to know, I noticed the star tattoo on your forehead, was wondering what it meant. It means I graduated astrology when I was in high school. I'm kidding, bro. I got that star in 1990 for the purpose of representing my membership to the NR. Back in the early 90s, it was pretty common for NR members to get stars as a way of representing their membership in the NR. But stars have taken on different meanings over the years. If someone has a star tattooed on them, it just depends on the time frame of when they got it that determines the purpose. In the 60s and 70s, a hollowed out star could have meant a hit for the O. If it was blackened in, it could have meant an ultimate sacrifice, a kill, or a body. In the mid 80s to the early 90s, it could have meant that you were an NR member. After the 90s into the millennium, it meant absolutely nothing. I started seeing youngsters coming into prison as first termers with 10, 15 stars blasted all over their chests and their bodies that didn't represent nothing other than their association with being a norteño. So Larry de Los Angeles wants to know, if Conejo got stripped down to a Cat 1, how did he ever have influence over DC? You gotta understand that Conejo's been around for a long time. He's got close to 30 years of service within the O. So although he may have been stripped and demoted, his influence was still there. If there was anyone who would have had any influence over DC at all, it would have been Conejo. And it's not that they've just known each other for a long time. You've got to understand that DC is getting old and he's just basically rolling with the punches. Like I said in one of my previous answers, I know DC well, and when it comes to internal disparities with other Cs, he's non-confrontational. He's easily manipulated and he's easily influenced. Just trust me on that. The other thing is this, when Operation Black Widow commuted the former leadership to the feds, DC, Conejo, and maybe a small handful of other Cs were the only ones left who had been around for some time. So they naturally all banded back together. These circumstances created a vacuum effect and left a lot of these brothers feeling desperate. Everyone knew that Conejo had been stripped and that he was under strict directives to never hold any more leadership positions. But all of a sudden, because of the circumstances, everyone seemed to forget about that and it made it okay. All these other Cs that now make up the state's leadership are all young Cs. Most of them came in after me. So, Orochimaru 92, however you say your name, you mentioned in your book that an AB member by the name of Frank gave you a kite from Corny and Pinky, advising you that 2 NF members that were giving you a hard time in the SHU were dropouts. My question to you is, why would an AB member go that far on helping you out if the NF and AB are enemies? This is an easy question. There's several reasons why. For one, even though we were enemies, we were convicts, and that's what convicts do. This AB member, Frank, and his cellie, Beaver, apparently already knew that those 2 cats were dropouts and that they were trying to mislead me. If the shoe would have been on the other foot, I would have done the same thing for them if I would have been active and I see a young white kid getting misled by 2 degenerates that I knew were dropouts. Then it becomes preserving the integrity from one active cat to another. This AB Frank went further than just passing the kite. He actually ran into Corny and Pinky, ran down the situation to them, and this is what prompted Corny to write me that kite. I wasn't expecting it and it caught me completely off guard. I don't know if you've ever done time, but I'm from the old school and I always operated under the belief that before affiliation, we're all convicts first. And sometimes convicts have to be convicts. I don't know what perception or belief some people are under, but just because we were all enemies up there in Pelican Bay SHU, we coexisted together and we still interacted on some level. Even in the early 90s, when the door policy was, if the door opens and the opposition is on the tier, it's mandatory to torpedo out and handle your business. No exceptions. You had to engage. But even in light of this policy, we still shared literature with each other, we still talked football on Sundays, and we still engaged in good conversation. You want to talk politics or world affairs? It's all good. We can talk and associate like convicts, but at the same time, we all understood that if the doors cracked, we were going to come out and try to kill each other. And when it was all over, we could still finish that chess game or that conversation, because again, that's what convicts do. Why make our living environment worse? Why live in a hostile environment where everybody's mad dogging each other, everybody's walking around with their chest poked out, and everybody's playing them YA games? If new Sureños came into our pod and they didn't have none of their people in there, I'd give them some reading material, some toothpaste, soap, deodorant, some coffee, some stationery and writing material, and maybe a little something to grub on. When we hit our yearly packages, the Sureños, the ABs, everybody in the pod would get touched with a small care package. That's what we used to do. These are some of the unwritten rules with respects to common courtesy, tier etiquette, and public relations that convicts live and abide by. So that's why Frank did what he did, because he seen someone who was active at that time being misled and he knew it was wrong. So the Martin 9400 wants to know, having seen the MA indicted for RICO in 1995, why didn't the NF make revisions to their constitution in anticipation of NF leadership one day also being indicted? The MA trial ended in 1997, 4 years before the Black Widow indictments came down. I agree. That's the magic question that I'm sure has been asked 1,000 times. They were well aware of the MA's indictments in 1997, and I'm sure they could have learned some things from their trial. But that wasn't the NF's first rodeo either. They knew it was coming and had plenty of warning signs. I was up there when they shipped everyone out. Everyone knew weeks in advance that this was coming. Law enforcement even gave all the signals, but despite knowing this, there was no contingency plans and nothing was done to minimize the damage control. What it was this: to acknowledge that this was coming and to begin making those preparations would have meant one thing. That would have meant that some of the leadership positions would have been passed over and a new leadership would have been delegated. This was something that leadership wasn't having no part of. It wasn't so much that they really cared about the positions themselves, it was the money that they cared about. Giving up those positions meant giving up that money. So Raul De Leon wants to know, what do you think of Skip trying to recruit Fresno back into the fold of the NF? I think it's a good thing, without a doubt. I always liked the homeboys from Fresno, and I always thought that this separation was a bad thing. Fresno's always been a huge part of the Norteños' history, and I think it's a good thing that Skip recognized the potential in keeping the peace and bringing them back into the fold. When I first started doing time back in the late 80s, the fellas from Fresno were still out there on the yard with us. They were always deep, and there was a lot of solid dudes from out there. Fresno's like 18th Street to the Sureños. If they fell off and went solo, the Sureños could make it without them, and they don't need them, but they're deep and they lose a lot of numbers. When the federal branch of the NF asserts control over the state, hopefully they'll start pushing for that same type of unity in the state with regards to Fresno. There's a lot of bad blood, and this conflict has gone on for almost 20 years, but it would be good to see them put those differences aside and come back together. So Chris wants to know, if they were to make a movie about the NF, what past member would you choose the movie to be of or around? It would be one of 6 individuals. Any one of these 6 would make a good storyline because they all have a lot of history and they all have good stories behind them. This isn't in order, but I just have to say Robert Babo Sosa from Santa Barbara, Joe Death Row Joe Gonzalez from Oxnard, Mike MC Castillo from Salinas, Robert Brown Bob Viramontes from Morgan Hill, Cornelio Corny Tristan from Woodland, or Sheldon Skip Villanueva from San Jose. So one Flint Cloud Serpent wants to know, how does the NF runs Kings, Fresno, Tulare, Kern counties? Any significance to these areas? What's the history of the NF in these areas? It runs these counties the same way it does all the other counties further up north. There's no significance to these areas other than the fact that there's a lot of history in the valley. There's history all over Northern California, but it's just a known fact that counties like Salinas, San Jose, Stockton, Fresno, Kings, Kern, Tulare, Visalia, etc., all have a lot of NF history in them, and that the NF has always had a heavy presence in these areas. There's a different culture out there. In the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, Hayward, and some of the other Bay Area cities, the Norteño culture still exists, and there's still a lot of homeboys that grow up identifying with that lifestyle, but they're not the same. It's just not as prevalent as some of those other areas. There's a different mentality and a different vibe out there. But in some of these other areas, it's a culture that still exists heavy, and the Norteño culture is something that's heavily ingrained out there. As far as how the NF operates, geography doesn't change nothing. The NF gains control over an area, they maintain control over this territory, make it theirs, they sell their drugs, terrorize the community, and then everybody gets indicted and gets sent to prison. Mr. Al Wes wants to know, from your book, whatever happened to the guys from Ukiah? Wormy, Pep, the white guy, Rob, whose name I forgot, etc. Wormy lives in Santa Rosa, Pep still lives in Ukiah, and I'm not sure what happened to Rob. Life goes on, people get old. I haven't really been back out to Ukiah since Vicky passed away. I went out one last time to get some closure for both me and her mom, and then of course to pay my condolences. David Rojas wants to know, do the MA and NF get along in the feds, or is it on site? They've had their disagreements, but it ain't on site. For the most part, they coexist and just do their thing. Politics are a lot different in the feds. Everything's broken up by states. Shanu Michael wants to know, do you know William Ainsworth? If so, did you do time with him? No, I don't know him. I know who he is as I've seen his channel on YouTube, but other than that, don't know him, never heard of him, and I've never ran into him in the system. So Zab Zuda wants to know, compared to the early days of the NF versus MA, there are a lot more Sureños than Norteños. If the MA really wanted, do you think they could take out the NF today? I'm gonna say no on that one. The NF, or just the Norteños in general, have always been the minority, and it's never threatened to put an end to their existence in the past. Granted, the Sureños and the MA have definitely got the numbers. There's no doubt about that. It's always been like that from as far back as I can remember. But as small as people might think that the NF is, they're still a powerful organization, and I just don't see them getting taken all the way out. Hasn't that been the MA's objective since the 60s? Before they forged this peace treaty, the MA's objective has always been to eliminate the NF by any means possible. I'm not talking the NF up either, but this just doesn't pertain to the streets, this pertains to behind the walls as well. As far as I can remember, the Sureños have always been the majority on almost every main line in the state of California, with the exception of San Quentin, and that's only because that's the reception center for Northern California. So McGee 40 wants to know, do you think the Fed faction is looking to try to pull the Fresno card from the feds? It sounds like the guys in the feds are good recruiters, convincing. If they would bring Fresno back in, do you think everyone from Fresno would fall in line? That's a good question, but I'd have to say no. There's too much bad blood, and it would take time. All those who oppose the reunification would have to get weeded out and removed. You're always going to have those that are going to resist and disagree. It's red on red all over again. If you've read my book, then you know what I'm talking about. When we pulled the plug on the NR and disassembled that movement, it took years to weed out and remove all the rogue NR members who believed that they had earned their own right to become independent. The ones who thought they had become their own entity and who felt that they were no longer subordinate to the dictates and decrees of the NF. It would be the same type of internal conflict. A lot of those guys from Fresno would probably feel like they're being dictated and that they're surrendering Fresno back to the enemy. That's just a reality. Then there would be others who would fall in line, but the loyalty would take some time before it could be trusted. As far as them being recruiters, that's exactly what they are. In fact, those brothers, Corny, Skip, Pinky, and some of the others, that's what they are. They're recruiting machines. That's what they do. And since they've been in the federal prison system, that's all they've been doing. So Daniel Freso wants to know, you should give us the ends on Prison Inc., specifically the Norte stuff. What tattoos to avoid before hitting the pinta, and which ones do gente have to earn or their meaning behind them? I believe I already answered the one on the stars, but I'm going to answer it again. Some tattoos have different meanings and represent different things, but this is dependent on the time frame when these tattoos were done. For example, In the 60s and 70s, blackened in stars represented a kill or an ultimate sacrifice. A hollowed out star represented a hit or a stabbing. In the late 80s and 90s, a star represented membership within the Nuestra Raza. Later on in the millennium, stars really held no true meaning other than the northern star and the mere association with being a norteño. Well-gut birds also had alternate representations. In the mid-80s to the early 90s, a well-gut bird represented your membership within the NR. But later towards the millennium, just like stars, they held no significant meaning other than their association with being a norteño. Anything representing the NF, i.e. Familiano, Carnal, Nuestra Familia, or the NF insignia, which is a sombrero with a dagger piercing through it, can only be gotten by NF members. There's so many other tattoos out there representing other things, threats, opposition, and other identifiers that I'd literally be here all night if I broke them all down. The Aztec numerals are another tattoo that should be identified. 14 is 2 lines with 4 dots over it. 13 is 2 lines with 3 dots over it. Each line is 5, so together it equates to 10 with the number of dots. The word Pili is used and reserved by the MA to identify MA members. It stands for nobility and reverence. Some of the other tattoos that you should just be aware of as a norteño is obviously the MA insignia, a black hand, and some of the Aztec shields that some of their camaradas get to represent different things such as status, nobility, and different traits of being a warrior. The chamali, campol, or the spear and shield are also tattoos of significance for their camaradas. Campol means sureño, warrior. The chamali is an Aztec warrior shield commonly used by the Eme to represent sacrifices made by a warrior. It's considered a badge of honor. If I was to give any advice about getting tattoos representing your status, like the Nuestra Familia I had on the back of my head, I suggest you don't get nothing. The smart ones don't get no tattoos, let alone ones that are gang related. At the time, you might feel a sense of honor for proudly representing your status, but this can also work against you as well. They're identifiers, that's exactly what they are, and they can make you a target for law enforcement. Not only that, but trust me, if you have tattoos on your head or your face like me, it doesn't do shit to help you when you walk in that courtroom. They look at you like you're a menace and like someone they want to get off the streets. So Aichit in my hand wants to know, hey boxer, what's your biggest regret? Simply put, my biggest regret is probably moving out to Santa Clara County. Had I not moved out there, none of the things that transpired over the course of the last 10 years would have happened. So WSM Norte Striving wants to know, can you elaborate on the first civil war in the NF? Because it seems like that's what's going on now. There were a few, but one of the more notable ones involved the Black Bob Vasquez faction against the Robert Babo Sosa faction. History is now repeating itself because that war actually evolved behind Babo Sosa and his leadership being accused of misappropriations of organizational funds, no longer working in the best interest of the organization, and cowardism. With regard to the accusations surrounding the money, this derived from personal expenditures that Babo Sosa was accused of using for himself, and the other 2 charges stemmed from a directive Babo Sosa passed down during the time when they were under one of their first RICO indictments. Because Babo and all his top lieutenants were under indictment and were being charged with several homicides, Babo passed a directive down to scale back on the street killings due to the fact that it was causing too much negative scrutiny during their trial. A lot of the younger C's had no intentions on stopping and basically looked at it as an act of cowardice. Because of this, the Vasquez faction called for Babo's impeachment and demanded that he step down. Babo refused, and this caused an internal war. With the majority being with the Vasquez faction, they eventually prevailed and Babo was ousted. An open door policy was instituted for the purpose of giving Babo's leadership an opportunity to return to the fold. However, very few, if any, came back, and the majority remained loyal to Babo, ultimately electing to go down with the rest of the ship. This created an internal war. Vasquez and his supporters ended up having to hit several of Babo's lieutenants, but Babo's faction didn't go down easy, and the conflict lasted for months.